Imagine a country sitting on top of one of the largest oil reserves on the planet. A country whose elected leader dares to say, "This oil belongs to us." Now, imagine that within 2 years of making that statement, foreign intelligence agencies have bribed journalists, paid street gangs, planted fake newspaper stories, and organized mobs to storm through the capital, all to remove that leader and hand the oil back to foreign corporations. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly what happened in Iran in 1953, and the aftershocks of that single event are still reverberating today, more than 7 decades later, shaping everything from the 1979 Islamic Revolution to the hostage crisis, to the nuclear standoff, to the wars and proxy conflicts consuming the Middle East right now. This is the story of how Britain and the CIA overthrew a democratically elected government to protect an oil company. It is a story about greed disguised as geopolitics, imperialism dressed up as anti-communism, and a covert operation so brazen that the CIA itself didn't publicly acknowledge its role for 60 years, and at the center of it all is a man most people in the West have never heard of. A man named Mohammad Minsad, whose only crime was believing that a country's natural resources should belong to its own people. To understand how this coup happened, you have to understand how Iran's oil was stolen in the first place. And for that we need to go back to the turn of the 20th century, to a time when the Persian Empire was crumbling and European powers were circling like vultures. In 1901, a British financier named William Knox D'Arcy negotiated a deal with the Shah of Persia, Mozaffar Ali Shah Qajar. D'Arcy was a wealthy socialite who had made his fortune from a gold mine in Australia, and he had a taste for high-risk ventures. The deal he struck was breathtaking in its scope. In exchange for £20,000 in cash, another £20,000 in company shares, and a promise of 16% of annual net profits, D'Arcy received the exclusive right to prospect for, extract, and sell oil across an area covering nearly 500,000 square miles of Persian territory. That is an area larger than the entire country of South Africa, handed to one man for pocket change. Now, the Shah who signed this deal was not exactly negotiating from a position of strength. The Qajar dynasty was broke. The country had no modern institutions, and the Shah himself had been softened up with what historians politely call handsome bribes to key officials. The British minister in Tehran, Sir Arthur Harding, personally lobbied for the deal. This was not a negotiation between equals. This was a fire sale, and D'Arcy walked away with one of the most valuable concessions in history. But finding oil in Persia turned out to be far harder than expected. The southern regions were brutally hot, reaching 50 degrees C during the day and plunging to freezing at night. The terrain was controlled by hostile nomadic tribes who were suspicious of foreigners. D'Arcy poured money into expedition after expedition, led by a geologist named George Reynolds. And by 1904, he was nearly bankrupt. He had to sell a majority of his rights to the Burma Oil Company just to stay afloat. By 1908, over £500,000 had been spent, and the investors were ready to give up entirely. They sent Reynolds a telegram ordering him to cease all drilling. Then, almost like something out of a film, Reynolds struck oil. In May of 1908, at a site called Musjaidat Solomon in southwestern Persia, his team hit a massive oil field. Commercial quantities of crude came gushing out of the ground. The following year, in 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formally established to exploit the discovery. It would later be renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and eventually it would become British Petroleum, the company we know today as BP. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that explains everything that followed. In 1914s, just as the First World War was about to engulf Europe, Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, made one of the most consequential decisions in military history. He decided to convert the entire British Royal Navy from coal power to oil power. Oil was lighter, more energy dense, and gave warships a longer range. But Britain had no domestic oil supply. It needed a guaranteed source, and Persia had exactly what Churchill needed. The British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for £2 million. With that single transaction, Iranian oil became not just a commercial asset, but a strategic pillar of the British Empire. The British government now had majority ownership, two appointed directors with veto power over all company decisions, and essentially a guaranteed supply of cheap fuel for the most powerful navy in the world. For Iran, this meant something very different. It meant that the country's most valuable resource was now effectively owned and operated by a foreign government. Iranian workers labored in terrible conditions in the oil fields of Kustan. They lived in overcrowded shanty towns, while British managers enjoyed manicured lawns, swimming pools, and air-conditioned offices in segregated compounds. The oil company paid Iran a pittance in royalties and refused to let the Iranian government audit its books to verify that even those meager payments were correct. To give you a sense of how lopsided this arrangement was. In 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company reported after-tax profits of £40 million, Iran's share £7 million. That is 17.5% of the company's profits. Meanwhile, the British government was collecting more in taxes from the company than Iran was receiving in royalties from its own oil. The British were literally making more money taxing the profits from Iranian oil than Iran was making from owning the oil. Let that sink in for a moment. And the exploitation extended far beyond the balance sheets. In the city of Abadan, site of the company's massive refinery, which at its peak was the largest in the entire world, a rigid system of segregation separated British staff from Iranian workers. The British lived in a pristine green suburb with modern homes, cinemas, swimming pools, and social clubs. Iranian workers, the men who actually operated the machinery and hauled the crude, lived in a district called Kagazabad, which literally translates to paper city, because many of the dwellings were made from flattened tin cans and old packing crates. There was no running water, no electricity, no sewage system. These men extracted one of the most valuable commodities on earth and went home to shacks. When Iranian politicians attempted to negotiate better conditions, the company stonewalled them. When the Iranian government asked to audit the company's books to verify that even the pitiful royalties were being calculated fairly, the company flatly refused. This was not just economic exploitation. This was humiliation on a national scale, and it bred a fury that would eventually consume everything. And it gets worse. The company invested millions in expanding operations, building refineries around the world, assembling a massive tanker fleet, and developing new oil sources that would eventually compete with Iran, all funded by revenue generated from Iranian crude. But the profits from these subsidiary operations were kept off the books when calculating Iran's royalty payments. So Iran was not just being underpaid, it was being systematically cheated by a company that used Iranian wealth to build an empire and then hid the profits from its host country. By the late 1940s, the arrangement had become intolerable. Across the Middle East, nationalist movements were challenging the old colonial order. In Saudi Arabia, the Arabian-American oil company, known as Aramco, had agreed to a 50-50 profit-sharing deal with the Saudi government in late 1950. This was a landmark moment. If the Americans were willing to split profits equally with the Saudis, why should Iran accept 16% from the British? The comparison was humiliating, and it lit a fire under Iranian politics. Enter Muhammad Mossadegh. Born in 1882 into a prominent aristocratic family, Mossadegh was educated in Europe, earning a doctorate in law from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. He was a career politician, a constitutional nationalist, and by all accounts an eccentric and theatrical figure. He was known for weeping during speeches, for receiving foreign dignitaries while lying in bed in his pajamas, and for fainting during parliamentary sessions. Whether from genuine emotion or calculated drama, no one was ever quite sure. But behind the theatrics was a razor-sharp legal mind and an unshakable conviction that Iran's resources belonged to the Iranian people. Mossadegh had been railing against foreign exploitation of Iranian oil for decades. In 1944, he returned to parliament and began organizing what would become the National Front, a coalition of democratic, liberal, secular, socialist, and Islamic factions united by a single demand, the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. The movement gained momentum through the late 1940s as frustration with the Anglo-Iranian oil company reached a boiling point. The tipping point came on March 7, 1951, when Prime Minister Ali Razmara, who opposed nationalization, was assassinated by a member of a radical Islamic group called the Fadayan-e-Islam. Razmara had argued that Iran lacked the technical expertise to run its own oil industry. His murder shocked the political establishment, but it also removed the last major obstacle to nationalization. 8 days later, on March 15th, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. Every single member voted in favor. Not one dissented. On April 28, 1951, the Shah confirmed Mossadegh as prime minister after the Majlis elected him by a vote of 79 to 12. Within days, Mossadegh signed the nationalization law into effect. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was to be dissolved and replaced by the National Iranian Oil Company. Iran's oil would finally belong to Iran. The reaction from London was immediate and furious. The British viewed nationalization not as a legitimate assertion of sovereignty, but as theft. Britain's response was a three-pronged strategy: economic warfare, diplomatic pressure, and the most insidious, covert action. The operation had two code names. The British called it Operation Boot. The Americans called it TP Ajax, or more commonly, Operation Ajax. The man chosen to lead the operation on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. Following the successful overthrow of Mossadegh, the Consortium Agreement of 1954 saw Iran's oil wealth carved up among Western corporations, while the Shah, supported by the CIA and the newly created secret police force Savak, consolidated his rule. The coup of 1953, designed to protect Western interests, erased the democratic space Iranians had fought for over decades. The consequences were profound, seeding the grievances that would erupt in the 1979 Islamic Revolution and continuing to shape the volatile geopolitical landscape